Alrighty, welcome back, boys and girls. We have a lot to talk about today. We're going to talk about all of the things that lead up to the Civil War. We're going to get into it, all the nitty gritty. This is an inherently political episode. I'm going to do my best to be as impartial and unbiased as possible, but like we talked about last time, it's impossible to keep all your bias out. Like I said, I'm going to do my best. Also, it is July, and I am in Texas. It's very hot, so I apologize if you can hear the fan in the background. But if I shut it off, I might die. So I'm going to leave it on. That said, let's jump into it. So, just a quick recap. It is 1848. Texas has been annexed. It is part of the Union overall. It is part of the United States. So are the New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and California territories. They are part of the Union. Most of them are not states yet. That said, the United States, the claims of the U.S. stretch from ocean to ocean. East Coast, West Coast, United States owns it all. 1848 is an election year, and tensions over slavery are rising. People are upset. Remember, there's mobs that are attacking abolitionists, and the U.S. isn't circulating their mail and all that kinds of stuff. So, popular sovereignty. A phrase that gets thrown around a lot. What does it really mean? It's the idea that as new states are entering the Union, they are going to decide for themselves whether or not to allow slavery. In theory, a good idea. You know, the people that are in the state get to decide what's going on in that state, how they get to, operate, how their economy gets to work, and how slavery is going to be interjected, if at all. Congress loves this idea because it relieves them of having to do anything having to do with slavery. Remember, the great silence politicians do not want to talk about slavery. It is too much of a hot button topic. Nobody wants to talk about it. So Congress likes this idea of popular sovereignty because that means it gets removed from national politics. It is a state politic. We don't have to talk about it. Northerners like this because in their eyes, it's going to be people who are from the north, mostly, again, the northeast, who are going to be settling in these new states who would then vote to make them a free state. Too much of the South's economy is based in agriculture and farming and owning land, and they don't believe that Southerners are going to just uproot from having owned land to go settle new land. So they believe it's going to be a lot of Northerners in these new territories. And if you look at our map here, we can see kind of what's going on. You can see the South there where slavery is legal, the Northeast where it's not, and then the Northwest, not the Northwest, but where the Northwest Ordinance was taking place, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, things like that. And then everything that's like shaded in that blue color, all of those territories are going to be, in theory, under the purview of popular sovereignty. And then all the way west, you can see California as a true state, not a territory, where slavery is not legal. And we'll talk about how that comes to be here in a second. But how does California become a state in the first place? The gold rush. 1848, gold is discovered in the mountains in California, and people rush there to find their fortune. Over 300,000 people go there over the next 2 or 3 years. And even before the gold rush is complete, there's enough people there to apply for statehood by 1849. Just in less than a year, there's enough people there to apply for statehood. And they do so as a free state. However, that's not a great thing to happen right now because there's no other territory that wants to become a state that has enough people who is going to enter the Union as a slave state. If you remember, to satisfy the Missouri Compromise, states have to get entered in pairs, one free state and one slave state, and there is no slave state or slave territory to enter the Union to satisfy the Missouri Compromise for California. So some people are a little bit upset about that, and there is a debate. If California were admitted as a free state to the Union, it would allow the free states to outnumber the slave states. And in the Senate, that means that the Southerners, people whose entire livelihoods and economy is based around slavery, would allow basically them to get outvoted, and slavery would get condemned and emancipation would get pushed very fast, in theory too fast for the economy in the South to adjust for non-slave labor, and it would cause everything to collapse. So the Southerners are not happy. What happens is another compromise. California becomes part of the Union as a free state under the conditions that the Fugitive Slave Act is strictly enforced, specifically in the North. Now, what is the Fugitive Slave Act? It's been around for a while. However, the North kind of decidedly came to the conclusion that they weren't going to follow it. But it is more or less as follows. Basically, all runaway slaves are going to get, they are tried, and then when they're assuredly found guilty, they're going to get returned to their owner. It also stated that a testimony by a white person was basically all that was needed to send an escaped slave back to the South. If a white person said, yep, I own that person, then, or if there was a witness that said, yes, I saw them escape, or whatever the case may be, that's all that was needed. There was no jury. That was the minimum. The other side of this is a monetary incentive program that incentivized government officials, maybe not to lie, but to certainly rule in favor of slave owners. So basically, a commissioner or a judge would earn a $10 fee if they ruled to send the slave back to the South. And they would only earn a $5 fee if they ruled that the slave could stay in the North. Or if they weren't a runaway slave, or whatever the case may be. Not guilty, essentially. So immediately that incentivizes, by a margin of 50 or 100% rather, for commissioners and judges to rule against the slave in favor of the slave owner. So that we already have. Not a great fair setup here. It also states that federal marshals they were required by law to assist slave catchers, and it allowed them to deputize those slave catchers. And if a citizen refused to be deputized and help the marshals catch slaves, they could be jailed. So now not only do we have a monetary incentive, we have like a freedom incentive. If you don't listen to us, if you don't help us, we're going to send you to jail. And then, of course, like most other things, heavy fines were imposed, big prison terms for anybody who helped runaway slaves. Not for the slaves themselves. That doesn't do anything for the slave owner. Sending a slave to jail only hurts the slave owner. So that was very, very rare. In terms of the Fugitive Slave Act anyways. But fines and prison terms for people who were caught helping runaway slaves, absolutely. And if you were in the wrong part of, especially the Deep South, someplace like Montgomery, Alabama, or something like that, you were liable to get lynched or worse. Anyways, before we move on, this is what gets enforced to appease the South, to allow themselves to be outnumbered in the Senate by allowing California to enter the Union as a free state. So just keep that in mind. The slave states are now outnumbered in the Senate. What else is going on? We have this thing called the moral resistance. If you've ever heard of Henry David Thoreau, he does a lot of writings during this time period, and one of his most famous is commonly referred to on civil disobedience. It's written in 1849, and basically it said, don't follow immoral laws, as a very broad overview. This is where the idea of what is just and what is legal are two different things. The law is not always right. That's where a lot of this comes from. And this resonates with a lot of people during this time period. And this is one of the many catalysts that push people who were maybe on the fence or people who were on one side but now to become more radical in the abolitionist movement and helping runaway slaves and things of that nature. This is where the Underground Railroad comes into play. What it is, the textbook definition is an informal, well-organized group of people that helped enslaved people escape their bonds. What this is just a group of people that came together to help escaped slaves, runaway slaves, make it to a place where they wouldn't be sent back, where they would be safe, where they wouldn't be extradited back to the South, basically. This was not actually a subterranean railroad. This was underground in the sense that it was out of the public eye, out of the eye of the government, out of the eye of a lot of Southerners. People were not very open about it. It was very secretive. And the members, who were called conductors, would provide runaways with all sorts of things. It could be, yep, you can stay in my house tonight and I'll feed you. It could be, here, take this money to get to the next place. It could be, hide in this wagon and we'll take you to the next town. Or even further, we'll take you to the next state. We'll get you to the border. We'll get you to X place. Sometimes even all the way to Canada. It depended. A lot of people did a lot of different things. And remember, all of this is being done despite the fact that everybody just agreed that the Fugitive Slave Act was going to be harshly enforced. So these people are taking a really big risk to do what they think is right. One of the most famous conductors is Harriet Tubman. I'm sure you guys have heard of her. She herself was a runaway slave and even had a bounty put on her head by slaveholders. There was a price put on her head to be taken dead or alive by slaveholders in several different states. But she really became, especially in hindsight, maybe not at the time, but certainly after several books were written about her, biographies, she became our modern face of the Underground Railroad. And not to disparage what she did probably more than most. She did a lot of very important things. But she didn't have in her own time period the amount of fame and name recognition that she does now, despite the fact that she had a price on her head. The Free Soil Party. So right before, we said 1848 was an election year. Right before that, a bunch of anti-slavery politicians from a couple of different parties, they come together to form the Free Soil Party. And their whole founding ideal was being anti-slavery, maybe not quite abolitionist, but anti-slavery. What they wanted was no slavery in the new Western territories. They basically were okay with slavery existing where it was, But any of the new territories that get set up by the U.S. And then eventually apply for statehood, their idea was, basically the idea that the U.S. would eventually have with communism and containment. We can let it exist where it is right now, but we just can't let it spread. And they a little bit had kind of a backhanded reasoning for this. Ultimately, they wanted slavery not to exist in these new territories because it would make it harder for the farmers who are moving there who don't own the land to find work. Basically, if the people who are moving there and settling these new territories could bring slaves with them or buy slaves, it would take jobs from free white men. So they had, in theory, on the surface, kind of a noble formation ideal with some, unfortunately, underhanded reasoning behind it. But this is the first official anti-slavery party gets formed in 1848. And while all that is happening, everybody is just mad. Everybody's upset with everything. Nobody is happy with any of their station right now. First, we're going to talk about the Transcontinental Railroad because it's going to become an increasingly big deal as we get up to and then after the Civil War. So everybody knows that they're going to build one. Everybody knows that we need one. We need to connect the East and the West. And by the East and the West, we kind of mean the center of the country and the West. So if you look at our map here, you can see anything that's outlined with the little railroad hashes in the East. Those are just major railroads. There are tens of thousands of miles more than that, but those are all major railroads. And they take up much of the traditional East Coast and pretty far in. You can see it's as far as Ohio, Illinois, Louisiana, Missouri. So we're really connecting the center of the country to the West, even though it's very typically referred to as connecting East and West. The East is already connected to pretty much everything. So anyways, sorry. The debate is over whether it's going to take a northern route or a southern route. And there's a debate because the area around the Transcontinental Railroad is going to get developed very fast because there is a railroad there. It's going to make travel, transport, import, export between states, trade, commerce. It's going to make everything easier and more cost effective. So those areas are going to get developed first, and that means more people there faster. That means those territories are going to become eligible to apply for statehood faster. That means they're going to have more power in Congress faster. You can see where we're going with this. Eventually, it comes that they're going to pick a southern route. But to take the route that the government originally wants, we must purchase even more land from Mexico. This is called the Gadsden Purchase, and we'll talk about kind of where that comes into place. I'll have another map of it here when we talk more about it. But what this does is really flesh out our southwest border with Mexico the way that it is today, more or less. So we take a southern, we pick a southern route. This makes people upset. We spend more money to get more land from Mexico. While all of that is happening, the Missouri Compromise is kind of falling apart. Both sides aren't happy that the compromise isn't being followed. The South isn't pleased because now they're outnumbered, even though the Fugitive Slave Act is being enforced. They're getting kind of their butts kicked in Congress because they're outnumbered. And the North doesn't really love it because even though, yeah, we're winning right now, there's nothing stopping, what would be Arizona and New Mexico, applying for statehood tomorrow and as slave states, and now we're outnumbered. If we're not going to follow the compromise for the South, there's no reason that we would follow it for the North. So they're on edge about it as well. The way this gets quelled, at least for the time being, is a one-time deal called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In theory, Kansas and Nebraska would come in basically on the same terms that the Missouri Compromise allowed. Kansas would enter as a slave state, Nebraska would enter as a free state, and it would keep things as they were for the Fugitive Slave Act compromise. As we're going to see, a lot of things come together and kind of throw everything off keel. This thing called Bleeding Kansas happens, and leading up to it, Kansas is given popular sovereignty. So almost right off the bat, this deal, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, is thrown right out the window. Kansas is given popular sovereignty, so it's not just immediately going to come in as a slave state. It means the people there are going to decide whether or not it's a free state. So people from all over the place flock there in order to gain a majority so that when they do vote, they'll vote in favor of, in theory, wherever they came from. So a lot of Northerners from New England go there to vote as a free state, and a lot of people from Missouri flock there to claim it as their respective territory so they can vote as for a slave state. And these people that are moving there are moving there permanently. They're not just going there to vote. The problem with people just going there to vote comes with these people that are going to be retrospectively called border ruffians. These are people from Missouri that are sneaking into Kansas with no intention of moving there or settling there and voting illegally for slavery. They are Missouri residents. They live in Missouri. They're not going to move to Kansas, but they're going to vote pro-slavery just to try to outnumber the free states. That way their neighboring state would have a similar economy to theirs. And this causes tensions to rise very, very quickly and to a point of violence. It's the violence that breaks out, the fighting that breaks out is called Bleeding Kansas. 200 people die. There's $2 million of, 1850 money in property damage. This is where John Brown, we'll talk about him in a second, this is where he gets his name. He and the guys that rode with him were merciless to slave owners and people that were pro-slavery. They killed a lot of them. That's another guy that could get his own episode. What this births is the Republican Party, though. So there's a bunch of politicians that are upset over the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which in theory is protecting the institution of slavery. They also don't like the Whig Party, which was a pretty dominant party at the time. They don't like that they're pretty complacent. They don't like that there were a bunch of border ruffians from Missouri. So a bunch of these politicians who have these feelings, they form the Republican Party. And this is the birthplace of our modern Republican Party. As of right now, 2025, Donald Trump is a Republican president. This is the same continuation of the Republican Party that we know today. It's the same, all the same. This is not one of those bait and switches that we've been talking about the past couple of episodes. This is where the modern Republican Party is born. It's a combination of a bunch of people from the Free Soil Party and some of the very few anti-slavery Democrats and some of the Whigs who were also upset with their own party's complacency. These people get together and form the Republican Party. The Republican Party is formed on the idea of anti-slavery. I'm going to tell you right now, as we're moving forward, the idea that the parties switch is wrong. That is a myth that never happened. I'm going to give you a spoiler moving forward. The Republican Party, like I said, is formed as an anti-slavery, pro-freed slave party. It is also the party in the 1960s that is going to vote in favor of the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 68. It is the Republican Party that gains African Americans their civil rights. And it is the Democrat Party that was anti-slavery during the lead up to the Civil War, during the Civil War, during the Civil Rights era in the 1960s. I said in the beginning of this episode that it's going to get inherently political, and I am doing my best to remain unbiased. And what I just said is unbiased. All of those things are facts. The Republican Party was formed as an anti-slavery party and was in favor of civil rights acts. And it was the Democrat Party that was pro-slavery and anti-civil rights acts. That is an undisputable fact. You can go and look up who and what their party was and what their representatives voted for what. Rant over. The intention of the Republican Party was to revive the spirit of the American Revolution. The idea of we are going to follow those founding documents to the letter. We are not going to be hypocrites. We are not going to, have our founding documents say all men are created equal and then have people owning other people. We're just not going to do it. We're going to keep slavery out of the new territories, and we're going to do our best to abolish it everywhere else. This outrages the Democratic Party, like I said, because they wanted to protect slavery. The Southerners were Democrats. They were pro-slavery. There's no way around that. This leads to a couple of different things, and one of the bigger ones is called the Dred Scott decision. It's going to set an unfortunate precedent moving forward. So now we're looking a half a decade later. It's 1857. James Buchanan is becoming president. In his inaugural address, he stated that he was going to let the Supreme Court decide the legality of slavery in the new territories. So remember, before it was we're going to do the Missouri Compromise, and then we were going to do the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and then it got turned into popular sovereignty. All of that stuff is gone, and the Supreme Court are going to be the ones that decide how and what territories come in as free states and slave states. There's a Supreme Court case called Scott v. Sanford, and again, broad overview. There was an enslaved man. He sued his master, the guy who owned him, for freedom, for his own freedom, on the grounds that he spent time in a free territory. So basically, this slave was taken to a free territory by the people who owned him because they were going to move there. And since slavery wasn't legal there, he sued for his freedom. Seems pretty straightforward. However, the Supreme Court ruled that African Americans, which is kind of a misnomer, I should rewrite that because they weren't African Americans yet, technically. Semantics. They ruled that enslaved people were not citizens and therefore they cannot sue in the courts. And the Supreme Court basically uses this decision to throw their hands up and say, we will not be deciding the issue of slavery in free territories. This is going to come up time and time again the next half a decade or so. Dred Scott and the Supreme Court saying, we can't help. Remember that time we said we can't help? We can't help. Sorry. So keep this in mind moving forward. The Supreme Court basically weaseled their way out of having to do their jobs. A quick rundown as we move forward of politics. The North are mostly Republican, anti-slavery, and pro-popular sovereignty. Remember, the Northerners like the idea of popular sovereignty because they are under the impression that it's going to be Northerners moving to the new territories, and it's going to be Northerners voting in favor of a free state. The South is largely Democrat, largely pro-slavery, and largely in favor of the Dred Scott decision. They like that the government is not getting involved in the decisions made for either free state or slave state, because remember, it's these people who are also in favor of the border ruffians, people, crossing borders, voting illegally, that kind of thing. I told you we were going to talk about John Brown. This is nowhere near, an all-encompassing rundown on him. Like I said, he deserves his own episode, which we'll probably do. But a quick overview here, our style on Cut Rate History, of what's going on, because I do think he deserves at least his own slide for the time being. So he is a very fervent abolitionist, and he believed that, quote, God had raised him up on purpose to break the jaws of the wicked. That is a partial Bible quote. If he believed that he was on a divine mission to hurt slave owners. He believed that he was basically given a free pass to use violence to teach enslavers lessons. He came up with this plan to seize a federal arsenal that was at Harper's Ferry, and he was going to use the arms there to free and then arm the enslaved people in the area. And he wanted a slave uprising against slave owners. He wanted an insurrection. And in 1859, he goes through with it. October, he and 18 other people seize the arsenal. And shortly thereafter, he was facing a contingent of U.S. Marines. Fun fact, these Marines were commanded by Union Colonel Robert E. Lee. He'll come up again several more times. He was captured and sentenced to death, long story short. To Northerners, John Brown was a martyr. He was everything that an abolitionist should and could be. He was in the American spirit of using violence to get his point across. The idea that, words only go so far. We've been trying X thing for so long. It has come time to take up arms to defend what we believe in. To the South, this incident was proof that Northerners were actively plotting the murder of slaveholders. And to their credit, at least in terms of John Brown, it was true. He was plotting their murder. But what this does is allow Southerners to take this and spin it as a way to fearmonger, basically. They're going to twist it to make it larger than it was, to make it seem like more people are like this than they were. It's going to become a sticking point for them. Lincoln takes office. We talked a lot about the Republican Party in their formation. And the Democrat Party at the time had a bunch of infighting. They couldn't really agree on anything. They couldn't agree on one person that they wanted to push forward. They ended up pushing forward a couple of people. Neither one was very strong. And this allows Abe Lincoln to easily win the 1860 election. He kind of rolls through it. Some things to know about Lincoln. He is anti-slavery, but not an abolitionist. What that means is he believes slavery is morally wrong. He doesn't want it to spread, but he also does not want to end slavery immediately. He knows that would tank the economy in the South. He knows that would severely hurt the economy in the North. He knows that would lead to probably a lot of violence. So he doesn't want to end it right away, and that's why he doesn't. The Civil War doesn't start until 1861. In theory, if he was an abolitionist, he could have signed an executive order that outlawed slavery, and that would be it. Of course, that would probably cause a civil war, but regardless. Like I said, he did not want to get rid of it where it already was. He wanted to contain it, kind of the same way that we talked about a few slides ago. The same idea as like the U.S. government in the 1960s with communism. We can let it exist where it is, but we just don't want it to spread. We don't want it to get larger. Keep this last bullet in mind for the entirety of the next episode, which is going to be about the Civil War. The thing that Lincoln cared about the most was preserving the Union. That's all he cared about. He cares about nothing more than keeping the United States together. He was going to do basically anything and everything he can to achieve that goal. That is all he cares about. Keep that in mind as we talk about the Civil War. It will help explain and it will help you understand some of the things that he does, especially early on. And secession begins. The South, like I said, is largely Democrat. They don't like that a Republican president has been elected. And a couple of southern states get together, they have a convention, and they vote in favor of secession. February 1st, 1861, the first 6 states secede from the Union. That is Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Excuse me. These states come together and they form the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America. They choose a guy named Jefferson Davis, another guy who deserves his own episode, as president of their new country. And ironically, like the people who saw John Brown as a martyr, these southern states believe that they are also acting in tradition of the American Revolution. They believe that they are fighting for their rights. They believe that, they are standing up for what they believe in. And it's this unfortunate, very intricate area where the debate of state rights in the Civil War comes from. We're going to talk more about it when we talk about the Civil War itself. But this is where that argument stems from, okay? Keep that in mind. It's this idea of the southern states don't want to be told what to do by northern states. Somebody in Texas doesn't want to be told what to do by somebody in New York. That is how the Americans felt when it was just the 13 colonies and somebody in England was telling them what to do. They think that they feel, that they are uprising, that they are seceding from a tyrannical government that won't let them exercise the rights that they believe they're afforded. That is where this argument comes from. It gets very muddy, very fast. Both sides get slandered. Like I said, I'm going to remain as impartial as I can. But just know that this is the beginning of that argument. Right or wrong, we'll get into it. But just keep that in mind. This is where we're going to end this episode. Let me know what you guys think so far. We're quite a few episodes in. Next time, like I said, we'll talk about the Civil War. Again, like everything so far on this channel, it's going to be a fairly broad overview of the Civil War. And then once we finish the series on the roughly complete American history, we'll go back and hit other parts on much deeper dives. But we're just doing, broad overview, broad strokes in the beginning. We'll cover everything and then go back to the cool parts and talk about fun stuff. If you guys have any ideas of episodes that you want me to highlight, any cool vignettes you want me to do, just let me know what you guys want, and I will do my best to give that to you. Like I said at the beginning, I'm going to spread out my posts a little bit more. These videos do take a little while to, make the slideshow and then record and then the little bit of editing that I can do. And I just can't do that with my work schedule right now, so I'm going to spread them out just to ease up a little bit. Other than that, thanks for coming out, and I'll catch you in the next one.